November 8th, 1519. A line of a few hundred men walks out onto a causeway floating above a lake, heading toward a city that seems to rise directly out of the water. Canals instead of streets. Floating gardens stretching for miles. Temples taller than any building most of these men have ever seen. And waiting for them at the gate is the ruler of an empire that stretches across most of what is now central and southern Mexico. That empire can call up armies in the tens of thousands. This city alone, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, is home to more people than Paris, Rome, or London at the time. Nobody in Europe has ever seen anything quite like it. And the men walking toward it number roughly 500. Here's the question that's followed this story for 500 years. How does a force that could fit inside a modern shopping mall walk into the capital of one of the most powerful empires on Earth? And 2 years later, watch it burn to the ground? The easy answer is the one you've probably heard. Steel swords, gunpowder, horses nobody in the Americas had ever seen before. A handful of audacious Spaniards who simply outfought everyone in their path. That answer isn't wrong exactly. It's just badly incomplete. And once you see the full picture, this story becomes something far stranger, far more human, and honestly far more interesting than the legend. To understand how this happens, you first have to understand what the Aztec Empire actually was, because empire might be giving the wrong idea. By 1519, the Mexica people, the group we usually call the Aztecs, ruled through an alliance of 3 city-states: Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Together, they dominated dozens of smaller kingdoms and city-states across central Mexico, and they did it mainly through tribute. Conquered towns didn't get absorbed into one unified nation. They kept their own rulers, their own identities, but they were required to send goods, labor, and captives to their Aztec overlords, some of whom were destined for religious sacrifice, a practice deeply embedded in Mesoamerican religious life at the time. That system worked. It also made enemies. Lots of them. At the head of it all sat Moctezuma II, not the paranoid, superstitious figure later legend would paint him as, but an experienced ruler managing a genuinely difficult problem. An empire held together less by loyalty than by fear, tribute, and the threat of force. Keeping that structure standing required constant political balancing. It's a job that would test anyone. Now, thousands of miles away, on the island of Cuba, a minor Spanish nobleman named Hernán Cortés is about to make that job a great deal harder. Cortés was a lawyer by training and an adventurer by temperament, ambitious, calculating, and chronically short on patience for taking orders. In 1519, the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, authorized him to lead an expedition to explore the coast of Mexico. Explore, not conquer, not settle. Cortés had other plans. He set out with 11 ships, a few hundred sailors, roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannon. Small by the standards of a European war, absolutely massive by the standards of what he was about to attempt. Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico in the spring of 1519, and almost immediately did something clever and more than a little sneaky. He founded a town, Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, and had his men elect him its governor. On paper, that meant he now answered directly to the Spanish crown, not to Velázquez, the man who technically outranked him. It was a legal loophole dressed up as a town council meeting. Then came the moment that's become legend. Cortés supposedly burned his ships so his men couldn't retreat. It's a great story. It's also not quite what happened. What Cortés actually did was strip the ships of anything useful, sails, rigging, supplies, and then have them deliberately run aground or scuttled. Same effect, less cinematic method. There was no way home, so the only way was forward. And forward meant marching straight into the territory of the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent people who had spent generations resisting Aztec domination and paid for it dearly. When Cortés's small force arrived, the Tlaxcalans fought them hard. But after weeks of brutal skirmishing, their leaders made a calculation that would change the entire course of this story. These strange, heavily armed foreigners weren't really the threat. The Aztec Empire was, and a temporary alliance with the Spanish looked a lot more useful than another few decades of resisting Tenochtitlan alone. This is the detail that gets left out of the legend most often, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. From this point forward, Cortés isn't leading 500 Spaniards against an empire. He's leading a coalition, and the vast majority of the warriors in it aren't Spanish at all. With thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors now marching alongside his own men, Cortés continued toward Tenochtitlan. Along the way, in the city of Cholula, his combined force killed a large number of Cholulan nobles and warriors, an event historians still debate. Cortés claimed he'd uncovered a planned ambush. Other accounts suggest a preemptive strike meant to terrify anyone else who might resist. The truth likely sits somewhere between calculated self-defense and calculated intimidation. But either way, word of it spread ahead of the Spanish like wildfire. By the time Cortés reached the gates of Tenochtitlan that November, Moctezuma had a decision to make. And here's where we need to correct one of the most persistent myths in this entire story. The popular legend that Moctezuma welcomed Cortés because he believed the Spaniard was a returning god, the feathered serpent deity Quetzalcoatl. It's a fantastic piece of storytelling. Most historians today treat it with real skepticism. It appears prominently in accounts written years after the conquest, often by Spanish chroniclers or their indigenous collaborators working under colonial rule, which makes it look less like a contemporary belief and more like a story that took shape afterward. The more grounded explanation is simpler and honestly more understandable. Moctezuma was dealing with an unfamiliar, unpredictable force allied with thousands of his empire's enemies, and he chose caution and diplomacy over an immediate fight he wasn't certain he could win cleanly. That's not superstition. That's the calculation of a ruler trying to protect his city. Cortés, for his part, wasted no time turning hospitality into leverage. Within days of entering the city, he had Moctezuma effectively held hostage inside his own palace, ruling through him while quietly extracting gold and tightening his grip. It might have worked, too, if Cortés's own side hadn't nearly torn itself apart from within. Back in Cuba, Governor Velázquez was furious about being outmaneuvered by his own subordinate. So he did the obvious thing. He sent a much larger force, 13 ships and roughly 1,000 men under Pánfilo de Narváez, with orders to arrest Cortés and bring him home in chains. Cortés left Tenochtitlan to deal with this new threat. And in one of the more darkly funny twists in the whole story, he defeated Narváez's force at Chempoala and then simply persuaded most of the surviving soldiers to join him instead. The army sent to shut him down became reinforcements. Velázquez had, without meaning to, made Cortés stronger. While Cortés was away winning over his own would-be captors, the officer he'd left in charge of Tenochtitlan, Pedro de Alvarado, made a catastrophic decision. Fearing, or claiming to fear, an uprising during a major religious festival, Alvarado's men attacked and killed a large number of unarmed Aztec nobles and warriors gathered for the ceremony. Whatever fragile peace had existed shattered instantly. Cortés returned to a city in open revolt. The alliance through hostage-taking strategy that had held for months collapsed within days. Fighting broke out in the streets. Moctezuma was sent out to try to calm his own people, and died shortly afterward, on June 29, 1520, under circumstances that remain genuinely disputed. Spanish accounts claim he was struck by stones thrown by his own furious subjects. Other accounts, then and now, suggest the Spanish killed him once he'd outlived his usefulness. We don't have a way to settle this definitively. It's one of the real, unresolved questions of the conquest. What happened next is not in dispute. On the night of June 30th, now remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, Cortés's forces tried to flee the city across the causeways under cover of darkness. It went about as badly as a retreat can go. Aztec warriors attacked from canoes and rooftops. Causeways collapsed under the weight of fleeing soldiers. Men loaded down with looted gold drowned in the canals, too weighed down to swim. By the time the survivors reached the mainland, a large portion of the Spanish force and a great many of their Tlaxcalan allies were dead. It was by any measure a catastrophic defeat. If the story ended here, this would be a tale about Spanish overreach and Aztec resilience. Instead, something else was already spreading through the city that no one on either side fully understood yet. Something that would prove far more devastating than anything that happened on that causeway. A soldier in the Narvaez expedition had unknowingly carried smallpox into Mexico. The Aztec population had no prior exposure to the disease and no biological resistance to it. As Cortés regrouped among his Tlaxcalan allies, smallpox tore through Tenochtitlan with horrifying speed, killing enormous numbers of people, including the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, who had led the resistance against the Spanish for barely 80 days before he too was gone. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's not a footnote. It's arguably the single most decisive factor in everything that follows. An epidemic neither side could see coming, understand, or control did more damage to the Aztec Empire's ability to resist than every Spanish sword combined. A young noble named Cuauhtémoc became emperor in the aftermath, inheriting a city devastated by disease and grief, and he organized what resistance he could. But Cortés spent the following months rebuilding, not just his own shattered force, but the much larger coalition around it. He had 13 small ships, brigantines, constructed piece by piece, and hauled overland to Lake Texcoco, giving him the ability to control the water surrounding Tenochtitlan for the first time. By May of 1521, Cortés laid siege to the city. And here's the detail that the 500 Spaniards version of the story leaves out almost entirely. By this point, the coalition besieging Tenochtitlan numbered in the tens of thousands, and the overwhelming majority of them were Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, and warriors from other city-states that had their own long-standing reasons to see the Aztec Empire fall. The handful of remaining Spaniards were, in a very real sense, a small and useful piece of a much larger indigenous war against Aztec dominance. The siege lasted nearly 3 months. Cut off from food, clean water, and reinforcements, and still reeling from the epidemic that had swept through months earlier, the city's defenders fought street by street, canal by canal, in conditions historians describe as increasingly desperate. On August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan finally fell. Cuauhtémoc was captured trying to escape by canoe. The human cost of those final months, from combat, starvation, and disease together, was immense. Precise numbers are still debated by historians, but there's no debate about the scale of the suffering. Within a few years, the Spanish built a new colonial capital, Mexico City, directly on top of Tenochtitlan's ruins, its temples and causeways buried beneath a new city that would rule the region for the next 3 centuries. But the deeper legacy wasn't architectural, it was demographic, and it was staggering. In the decades after the conquest, wave after wave of smallpox, measles, and other diseases, neither side had defenses against swept across central Mexico, killing far more people than the conquest itself ever had. Historians and demographers still debate the exact scale of that decline. Some estimates are genuinely enormous, but the broad consensus is that it stands among the worst demographic catastrophes in recorded history, one that unfolded almost entirely outside anyone's control or understanding at the time. For the Tlaxcalans and other former allies, the alliance initially brought certain privileges under Spanish rule, but colonization would eventually reshape, exploit, and diminish nearly every indigenous community across the region, regardless of which side they'd stood on in 1521. Out of that collision of empires, epidemics, and cultures, the foundations of modern Mexico were laid, a nation whose identity today is inseparable from both its indigenous roots and its Spanish colonial history. So, did 500 Spanish soldiers really conquer an empire of millions? Not quite. What actually happened is a small, opportunistic Spanish force exploited deep political fractures inside a tribute empire that had made no shortage of enemies, allied with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who had their own reasons for wanting the Aztecs gone, and then watched an epidemic neither side could see coming do more damage than any battle. Steel, horses, and Spanish nerve mattered. They just weren't close to the whole story. That doesn't make this a smaller story. If anything, it makes it a stranger and more human one, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can fall through a combination of old resentments ambitious outsiders, and forces of nature nobody involved could fully explain at the time. And Tenochtitlan's fall wasn't really an ending either. It was the opening chapter of something much larger. 300 years of colonial rule that would eventually give rise to its own revolutions, its own reckonings, and a nation still working out what it means to carry both sides of this history at once.